Welcome everybody to this latest talk in the Great Minds series being organised by the University of Buckingham. Welcome students, staff, residents across the country and community, and a particular welcome to school students from a whole range of schools in a wide catchment area. And can I say at the very outset that we are unbelievably privileged to have one of the country's greatest and most influential writers since the end of the Second World War talking to us tonight. And do have your questions ready, and I will inevitably be asking more questions from those who get the questions in early. Equally, I will want to have questions that are sparked by what Philip Pullman is coming to tell us. So roughly tonight, we're going to have the first 35 minutes or so with me asking Philip Pullman questions, and then over to you. But I might well feed in your questions when I'm asking my own. So Philip, tell us about your life in lockdown. How are you coping and managing? Are there upsides to your life at the moment?
Well, one of the upsides is that I can do nice events like this without actually having to get in my car and drive there. So that's one benefit. I think, as other writers have told me, it doesn't seem to make very much difference to lucky people like us, because we can stay at home and do our work without any difficulty and without any interruptions. People I feel sorry for, in particular, apart from those who have to live in a tiny flat with small children and nowhere to run and play, who are really having a terrible time. Yeah. I also feel very sorry for the effect this lockdown is having on the performing arts, music and theatre and ballet and so on, which depend for their very existence on an audience. We've had people playing at the Wigmore Hall, solo piano and that sort of thing, but it isn't the same without an audience. And how actors can manage on an empty stage with just a camera pointing at them, I don't know. So on the whole, I'm having it easy and I'm having rather a good time.
We'll come back and we'll talk about the arts later. Can you tell us about your house and how you organize the house and also your day, Philip?
Yes, well, starting with the day, it begins at 6:30 when I get up, let the dogs out, make a cup of tea, bring it back up to bed with my wife. I read the papers on my Kindle, and then I very slowly, very gradually get up and get dressed and washed and all that sort of thing. And I get to my desk at about mid-morning, and I work until lunchtime. At the moment, I'm writing the third book in the trilogy, which I call the Book of Dust. And I'm about 50 pages in at the moment, and it's going well, and I know where it's going. But it's going to be a long book, but it's going to be less long than it wants to be. It wants to be a long book, but I don't want it to be a particularly long book, so it's going to have to take some curtailing. The house is an old farmhouse about 4 miles outside Oxford. We've got a bit of land. We've got 7 acres of, well, rough grassland it was, and we're planting trees. So one of the delights of this extraordinary spring has been to watch the trees come into leaf, and watch the wildflowers, of which there seem to be more this year than before, which is a good thing, and the insects and the birds and so on. So as I said earlier, I'm extraordinarily lucky, and I try not to lose sight of that good luck, because I think one should be grateful for these things.
And the people are fascinated by how writers structure their day, and those writers who have a set time where they begin and end, and do you write with a pen or a pencil or a laptop? What's the mechanism, the process?
The physical process is that I write with a ballpoint pen on, I'm looking around for a piece of it at the moment, I haven't got it, on A4 paper, narrow lined. A4 paper fascinates me because of its extraordinary shape. It has this amazing ratio between the long side and the short side. Did you know, by the way, that the square on the long side of a piece of A4 paper is equal to the sum of the squares on the two short sides?
No, I didn't.
Well, there we are. You can try it and see. Yes, I always use a pen for the first draft of my books, and then as I go through, I put it chapter by chapter, more or less, onto the laptop so I can edit it quickly and easily. I work in the morning because my brain is active then. It goes to sleep at about lunchtime. Sometimes my body goes to sleep as well. If I've left the day's work unfinished, I go back to it in the early evening, sort of about now sort of time, but I'm all right, I'm done for the day now. After that, I make supper, watch the telly. Seem to be watching a great deal of telly recently.
Anything in particular you're enjoying?
Yeah, very much enjoying the French series Call My Agent.
Yes.
10%. Have you been watching that?
No, but I'm going to.
It's marvelous, really funny, really engaging, with interesting characters and a situation which I know about. You know, the world of agencies. They specialize in film and TV, but I know the whole world of literary agents has a great deal in common with that. It's a marvelous series. I'm enjoying it enormously.
And are you catching up with box sets and on BBC iPlayer and Netflix with things you've missed?
Yes, we didn't catch that series called Friday Night Dinner the first time it came around on Channel 4, and my son told me we should watch it, and we're watching that and thoroughly enjoying it. I think Tamsin Greig is marvelous in whatever she does, but it's very funny.
A question coming in: what is going to happen to your manuscripts? Are you conscious? It was the 150th anniversary of Charles Dickens's death yesterday, and obviously a great tussle over his manuscripts. Do you know where yours are going to go? What library and archive?
Yes, I'm going to give them to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I owe a great deal to the Bodleian Library because I didn't actually use it very much when I was an undergraduate because I was rather frightened of it. I didn't know, you know, which bit to go to or how to order a book or anything. But I made great use of it since I started writing novels that were likely to find a publisher. Everything is there. I must say I've used it rather less in recent years because you can get so much, even texts of old books on the internet. So I haven't made the physical journey into Oxford to consult the Bodleian very much, but it's a wonderful resource, and I decided quite a long time ago that I wanted to give my manuscripts to them.
Let's come back to the Philip Pullman story. Born in 1946, just after the end of the war, and partly in Wales, and then you went to East Africa. That influence of that on your creative imagination?
Well, like all children of RAF officers in the 50s and 60s, we moved around rather a lot. The British Empire was in the process of dismantling itself, and there were still outposts of the military part of the British Empire in places like Southern Africa, Australia, and dutifully my mother and my brother and I followed my father and then my stepfather to Rhodesia, as it was then, and then to South Australia, and finally to Wales, where I spent most of my teenage years. I think my mother put her foot down at that point when I was 11 and said, I'm not moving again for a while. So I spent all of my teenage years in Wales and was lucky enough to go to the local, it's now a comprehensive school, Ysgol Ardudwy, Ardudwy being the area, the district on Cardigan Bay, the coast of Cardigan Bay,
I'm
just
glad
south of Harlech. And I was lucky to go there because and I didn't realize this till much later. The teachers we had were all people who had been in the war in one way or another. Not so much the women who couldn't join the armed forces, but certainly the French teacher, for example, had sailed on the Arctic convoys. Geography teacher had commanded a tank. The Welsh teacher was he took part in the Normandy landings, something like that. And this gave, or they never talked about it. They never made a big thing of it. And we were too arrogant and incurious to ask. It's a great pity now. But what it gave them, I now see, was a kind of stature, a kind of certainty about themselves, which I certainly never had when I was a teacher, because I couldn't, I had nothing to compare the terror of facing 34 12-year-olds with the terror of facing Nazi naval guns in the Arctic. That gave my teachers a sort of presence, which, as I say, I'm now very lucky to have noticed, to have experienced.
And consciously or unconsciously, do these stories of travel by boat to mysterious darks up in the north, were they influencing your writing, and were you aware of that at the time?
I was aware of certain things. I was aware of Kipling, for example, and the Just So stories. Not so much the Mowgli books, but certainly the Just So stories, because he described things that I'd seen and I'd known about. There's a little poem, a little verse about the P&O, the Peninsula Orient Line, and because this was the early 50s, we travelled by ship, we travelled by sea, both to South Africa and then to Australia, and the experience of that is quite different from travelling by air. When you get to travel by air, you get in a metal tube and then you get out the other end, frazzled, worn out, maybe hungover, but certainly you don't get a sense of how big the world is. When you sail across the surface of it, you do. And I do have that sense of how big the world is, and also how the sea itself changes when you go north and south. How the grey North Sea and the Bay of Biscay changes to the blue of the equatorial and the calm of the equator, and then again to the green of the South Atlantic, the southern Indian Ocean as you sail across to Australia. All these things are sort of built into my body. They're muscular memories, they're nerve memories, and I think they've added to my sense of well, how big and how strange and how varied the world is.
And the impact, many writers have lost a parent when they were young. The impact of the loss of your father, RAF distinguished pilot, in Kenya when you were 8.
That was it is an odd thing. I was talking about this to Peter Dickinson, the great writer of children's books, some time ago. He also lost a parent, and it does seem to be the case. Oddly enough, the loss of my father when I was about 7 or 8 didn't affect me very much because we hardly knew him. He figures in my memory as a tall, laughing man with an RAF moustache and the smell of beer and cigarettes. That's about all I have to remember him by, all the physical memories, a number of photos. But I've been learning recently, thanks to an old RAF airman who took an interest in this, more about my father than I knew. And my brother Francis, a couple of years younger than me, has his logbooks, which are very interesting. He flew Spitfires at the end of the war. He then left the RAF and worked in a bank. Worked in the National Provincial Bank for a couple of years, got bored doing that, joined the RAF again, and subsequently lost his life in an accident during the Mau Mau insurgency, or whatever they call it now.
And then after your time in Wales at the school, and thank you for pronouncing it, I'm glad I didn't have to do that, Philip, you went to Exeter College, Oxford, read English, and that somehow didn't light you up. And then there were odd writers like Blake, who really interested you, and Milton had, I think, earlier in your life when you were younger with your grandfather. But what didn't work for you about reading English at Oxford?
Well, I discovered I wasn't really a critic. I didn't get the hang of reading books in a critical way. I was still trying to read Middlemarch for the story, for example. There is a story.
Idea.
There is a very good story in Middlemarch, but it isn't really the whole point of Middlemarch. So I discovered I wasn't very good at doing that. What I should have done, I now realise, 50 years later, 50 or more years later, I should have gone to become an apprentice to a cabinet maker. I would have enjoyed that no end. I do like working with wood. I do it a lot. I've got a good workshop and a lot of good tools, and there's nothing more satisfying than the pleasure of taking a nice piece of walnut or something and cutting it and shaping it and cutting the joints and making an attractive box or table or whatever it is. I would have been good at that, but I was too clever apparently to do that. The assumption was that if you were in the slightest bit clever, you had to go to university and get a degree. I didn't enjoy it. I enjoyed my time there because this was the mid-60s, and goodness me, if you didn't have a good time then, there's something wrong with you. I made a number of very good friends who I still count as friends, and I had a good time. But I got a third-class degree. It was the year they stopped giving fourth-class degrees. Otherwise, I'd have got one of those.
Really?
I think so. Yes.
Just say something more about cabinet making and working with wood with your hands. Is that something that all young people should be doing? There are many, thousands of young people listening.
I couldn't agree more. And the problem is, in most schools, and I saw quite a lot of schools when I was a teacher and a trainer of teachers, the problem is in a lot of schools, the woodwork teacher, or whatever they call it now, technology or something, doesn't have as much help as they need. If you've got a class of 20, 30, whatever it is, children learning woodwork, you need to keep all the tools they're going to use sharp and in good order. And it takes quite a lot of time to sharpen 30 chisels and make sure the saws aren't bent. And the woodwork teacher really does need more assistance than they usually get. So that's one problem. But I'm completely with you. Every child should have the chance to experience some kind of craft, whatever it is. The joy of wood for me is the tactile pleasure of moving a sharp plane across a board and hearing it, smelling it, sensing the way the steel meets the wood, all those sensual things that actually woodwork teachers don't talk much about, because they're talking about the fact that you haven't got the right angle here, you didn't use the mitre, etc. all that. So it's a sensuous, not sensual. This is Milton's distinction between the sensuous, which is to do with the senses, and the sensual, which is to do with the naughty stuff. The sensuous pleasure of working with the material, whether it's wood or clay or textiles or paint or whatever it is something that we must allow children. Now, I'm interested to hear about well-being and your ideas about this. Would this play a part in your scheme for education if you were in charge of the whole thing?
Definitely, Philip. We have an education system that is not very interested in the innate abilities of young people. The word education means leading out, and therefore there's a notion that there is something inside every single child which is needs to be drawn out by an education system. And at the moment, transparently, the least well off in Britain and the world have the least opportunity to have these creative chances and stimuli in dance and music and drama, creative writing, visual art. But way beyond those two, to have their own distinctive natures at the ground of their being drawn out, and therefore what they love in life and what gives them joy. And instead, we make them think that the passing of exams, which requires a very limited range of intelligence, is enough. So what did you think when you were at Oxford and leaving it? Were you going to do? When did this inkling that you were going to be a writer? Had the stories started forming in your mind?
Well, I'd make a distinction first of all between writing and being a writer. I've never liked the verb. I've always never liked the noun. I'd always rather go with the verb. It's the activity that interested me rather than the state of being known as a writer. I'd always written stories. When I was very young, I told stories to my brother and my school friends. I enjoyed writing stories immensely when it was something we had to do at school. I turned to poetry in my teenage years, some of which came to me through school and through Miss Jones, my beloved English teacher, whose photograph I'm looking at right now. But also some I discovered for myself, like modern poetry mostly. The beat poets, Allen Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, had a great influence on me in my teenage years. And through him, William Blake, and the other less sort of standard poets, you might say. And I wrote a great deal of poetry. And then along came Bob Dylan and inspired us all to pick up a guitar and set our rambling poetry to the three chords we knew how to play. And I did that for a while. But I'd always enjoyed stories so much, reading stories, thinking about stories, hearing stories, that the day after my final exams, I put down my gown and mortarboard forever and started writing a novel. And well, I haven't stopped. I think that's my form. It takes you a bit of time to find the form you're most at home in, and that seems to be mine.
And then you gradually came through teaching into part-time teaching between, I think, 1986 to 96, and then you became a full-time writer. And quite late, in a way, which is optimistic for many people. You started the Dark Materials trilogy, I think, in 1993, and I think Northern Lights was 1995. So by now you were coming up to your 50th birthday.
Yep.
That's very optimistic for all the many budding writers listening to
well,
this.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
I think, again, I'd been lucky. I'd spent the previous 30 years, most of which I spent teaching, were an apprenticeship. I learned how to tell stories in all sorts of ways. I learned how to tell a story orally to an audience by telling the children I taught the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey and various other Greek myths. I learned various things from that. I learned what I'm good at and what I'm not good at in telling a story. I also wrote plays, school plays to put on. And I learned a great deal from the way those worked. I was also writing novels. I published a couple of novels with no success at all. So I sort of knew how to do that. But by the time I came to his Dark Materials, I'd had a long apprenticeship, and I'd found a subject, a theme, if you like. I found something that I had been fascinated by for a long time, which is the change in William Blake's terms from innocence to experience. What happens when, during our adolescence, we discover things about ourselves that we didn't know before. Our bodies begin to change, our feelings begin to boil and bubble and enter a state of turmoil, but also our intellectual horizons are opened. We discover the power and the majesty of curiosity. And I was intoxicated by all that in my own adolescence. And when I was teaching children who were just entering that phase of their lives too, I watched and saw the effect it had on them. The growth of self-consciousness, for example, young children, nursery school children, primary school children, reception class children, are unself-conscious in that they'll run and dance and sing and jump and play with no sense that anybody's looking or that it matters very much. Suddenly, when your voice begins to break and your chin begins to sprout the occasional hair and your breasts begin to grow, whatever it is, you become much more self-conscious than you were. And this is paralleled, of course, exactly in the chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The first thing is that they become self-conscious. They make clothes to wear because they think God's looking at them. This is, of course, the theme of, if there is such a thing as a theme, of his Dark Materials. It's Lyra's growth from childhood to, into adolescence. And by the time I came to write that story, I had enough experience and craftsmanship to, I think, to do it justice.
So many questions, Philip. Ophelia, which you may well have covered, is what gave you the inspiration to write the Dark Materials? And a question here from Megan: if you were in the Northern Lights universe, what would your demon be? That's Megan from Royal Latin.
Well, I've been asked this question quite a lot, and I suppose I've set myself up for it, but I don't mind that, because I think my demon would be one of those birds that steal things, the corvids. I like to think she'd be a raven, because there's a sort of romantic, poetic aspect to ravens, both from the Trois Corbies, that wonderful ballad, up to Edgar Allan Poe's Raven, ghastly, grim and ancient raven, grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt and ominous bird of prey, that sort of thing. But my demon might be a magpie or a jackdaw. They steal things. They see bright things and they want them. This is what I do as a storyteller. I overhear things. I see things on the telly, or I read it in a book, and I think, oh, that's good. Yeah, I'll have that. So that's the nature of the kind of storytelling I do. So I think my demon would probably be one of the crow family.
And how does your picking up bits of information work? Do you just squirrel it away in your brain, or do you have a notebook or an iPad?
I don't have a notebook. At first, when I started, I thought I ought to. It was one of the things that writers did. Always carry a notebook everywhere, note down things. Well, I tried that for a week or two, and I found it so boring that I didn't bother anymore. If it's good, it'll stick. If it vanishes, it wasn't very good in the first place. The method, I suppose, well, it's summed up in what I put on Twitter, my Twitter bio, and it's that itself is stolen from the great American poet Muhammad Ali. I say, read like a butterfly, write like a bee. I read like a butterfly, which means that I don't read with any sort of settled plan. I don't sit down with a notebook and a pen and a pencil and a stern, critical, scholarly kind of way. I read what interests me, and when it stops interesting me, I stop. But when I write, I do it in a much more disciplined way, like a bee. I go back to my hive with the nectar I've accidentally picked up, and I make it into honey. I hope it is anyway. That's what it is. Read like a butterfly, write like a bee. That's what works for me.
And a question from Cherry. I love that. A question from Cherry here. When you wrote Northern Lights, had you already got the 2 sequels in your mind?
The whole story? No, I didn't. I knew she was going to go north, but I didn't know what was going to happen there. And my knowledge that she was going to go north was really based on the fact that I enjoyed Paradise Lost Book 2 so much, where Satan sets off on this voyage to come and corrupt this new race called man. Lyra wasn't going to do that, but Milton has a number of references to, for example, the Lapland witches, to this constellation of Ophiuchus in the northern sky, to things like that, and it just fired my imagination. I wanted to go there in my mind, so that's what sent her north. But as for what happened in the end, I hadn't the faintest idea. All that I knew was that she was going to grow up a bit,
and
that's all I knew.
Cicely says, was she your favourite character, and also, is there anybody in your real life who you based her on? Lyra.
Well, Lyra, no, she's not based on a particular girl, but she's based on a lot of girls, I suppose. A lot of girls I taught. There's a Lyra in every class. There's a Lyra in every, certainly Lyra's in every school. The point about Lyra is not that she's special. It's that she's very ordinary. It's that she's a very ordinary child. Perhaps she's a bit more of a tale teller, a liar than most girls are, and perhaps she has an unusual capacity for affection, but otherwise she's very ordinary. So that's where Lyra came from. My favorite character, one of my favorite characters is a man I'm dealing with at the moment. He appears almost at the end of The Secret Commonwealth, which is the second book in the Book of Dust series, a man called Abdel Ionides. He's a sort of shifty guide, servant. Dragoman was the word that used to exist for people who would help you and guide you and change your money for you and sort things out if you were journeying in the Middle East. I'm very fond of him, and I think he's got quite a long way to go. But apart from him, I'm very fond of Father Coram, the Egyptian boatman who turns up all the way through the story. He's very old now, as we see in The Secret Commonwealth, but I was glad to see him. So yes, I do have a number of favourite characters, but I don't ever base them on anybody real.
And Philip is asking you, Philip, about what's it like seeing your books adapted for the stage and screen. So there, his Dark Materials was performed by the National Theatre in 2003, and of course you've got the BBC HBO television series that started at the end of last year. How much control do you have? Is that terribly exciting, or is it slightly frustrating and hairy?
It's always very interesting, because it's been a big Hollywood movie. It's been on the big screen, where you can see the vastness of the landscapes and the immensity of the great wide spaces. It's been on the small screen, which is very good at showing you close relations between characters. I think Ruth Wilson and Daphne Keane play Mrs. Coulter and Lyra marvellously well on the BBC HBO production. And that's what the telly does very well. The stage, of course, is different again. On the stage, you can't have cinema style effects, but what you do have is moments of intense emotion which are communicated and shared and reflected back by the audience. The National Theatre production was absolutely wonderful, and I'm still in awe of what Nicholas Heitner managed when he did that. So all these different media have their different possibilities. I don't regret seeing it, well, not altered, but filtered, as it were, through these different media. It's always very interesting. I'm very flattered, of course, too, and the money's not bad.
So a question: how does that come about? How did you get to hear about the National Theatre, and just a bit more about how you were involved in that compared to the film on the big screen?
Mm. Well, I have an agent, of course, like most professional writers, and it's the agent's job to find other ways of making money from the work. And this is how the film came about. My agent interested a film company who wanted to who were willing to pay for the chance to make a film. That happened. The National Theatre was slightly different. I was actually on a book tour I was in Scotland. I think I was in Aberdeen, and a phone call came to my hotel room, and a voice said, "Hello, this is Nicholas Heitner at the National Theatre. I'd rather like to make a stage play of His Dark Materials. But, you know, do you think we could talk about that?" So I said, "Well, absolutely, yes, of course you can. Yes, let's talk about that." And it was a happy experience from the beginning. I got on very well with Nick Heitner. He found a writer, Nicholas Wright, who wrote a marvelous script. And with all the resources of that fabulous theatre, you know, the stage that goes round and the outer bit that goes round in the other direction, and the bit in the middle that comes up, and the other bit that can go down, and they used all of it. It was a tremendously technical production and a great feat of organisation to get it all to work. But they did, and it was you know, full houses, and they had another run, and it was a total thrill. I was able to go to some of the rehearsals and make a couple of suggestions, which they acted on at once because you know, they saw the sense of them. I didn't have as much power, nearly as much power with the film, because that's such a big thing. You know, hundreds of people all standing around with earphones or clipboards or camera or whatever it is, and there's so much money swirling about that you the writer, are invited there out of courtesy, and you go there and you meet the stars and you have lunch and all that sort of stuff. But there's nothing you can do at that stage in a film. The television thing was a sort of cross between the two, because I was consulted a lot by the makers of the television program, who were a company called Bad Wolf, working for HBO and BBC. Jane Tranter, the producer, was absolutely marvellous at sort of listening to me and allowing me to make comments. And I saw the script at all various stages, so I had quite a lot to do with that, and that was a pleasure. It always was.
And Cicely is asking more about that, and did it turn out how you envisaged it? And Eleanor, by the way, I was going to drop in what Eleanor says. She said, "I named my daughter Adelaide." This is out of sequence, partly inspired by the Tin Princess. So there you are. You made very happy if Adelaide's listening also.
I'm glad to hear it. I like Adelaide very much, and I've got a feeling she's going to turn up in another book later if I get through the COVID thing like everybody else. I'm sorry, what was the first question?
Were you happy with the way that television?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I was. It's got a lot to do with the cast, of course. I've had books of mine adapted quite well, but where the leading character wasn't the right actor for the part. And that's kind of difficult to put up with, because you can see all the way through, if only they'd cast X, this would work so much better. But with the BBC one, it was marvelous, because I wouldn't have changed any of the parts. I was able to make some suggestions, some of which were able to be taken up. But you know, you suggest such and such an actor because they're good, and if they're good, then they're in work doing something else. But Daphne Keane was an absolute miracle as Lyra. Ruth Wilson is so magnetic and so much on the cusp between wonderfully attractive and wonderfully evil, but she never fails either. So it was. I was very happy with it, and very much looking forward to the second series.
Question: do you enjoy becoming famous, and do you like being recognised in the street?
The only good thing about being poor and obscure is the obscurity. The only thing about being rich and famous, as far as I am rich and famous, is the money, because I don't have to worry about my pension and my old age and that sort of thing. The fame, well, you know, people are nice and they come up to you not because they want to say, oh, what a horrible writer you are, I hated your last book. They come up and say hello because they enjoyed the book and they want to say so. And I'm always pleased with that. It makes me, as I was saying about children in their adolescence, it does make me a little self-conscious sometimes. So perhaps I ought to have a disguise. Maybe a wig would do.
A false beard, I would fool everybody. Now, there were 17 years between The Amber Spyglass and the first book in the Book of Dust, what will be a trilogy, La Belle Sauvage. That 17 years gap was obviously intensely full for you. But were you forming in your mind Book of Dust?
Yes, I must have been, because I did write another couple of things about Lyra. A little short book called Lyra's Oxford. I wrote other books as well. I wrote a book about Jesus, which I found very interesting to do because it made me visit again a story that I thought I knew well. And reading the Gospels, as I obviously did for preparing for this, was quite a revelation to me. For example, how do we know what happened to Jesus in the wilderness? There was no one there apart from him. There weren't any witnesses as there were to several of the miracles and the Sermon on the Mount and so on. So who are we? Who's telling the story? That's a question which had never come to mind before, but that was the sort of thing. The other thing I did, the other big book I wrote during that period was my version of the Grimm Tales, or some of the Grimm Tales. That was wonderful fun. I loved it. I've always enjoyed folk tales, Grimm in particular, because I knew them quite well as a child, and coming back to them with the eye of a sort of practiced storyteller and someone who read quite a lot. In the meantime, I could see differences between this story and that one, which I hadn't noticed before. One of the people they relied on for their stories was a woman called Dorothea Fiemann. She was the widow of a greengrocer, I think, and she told them a lot of the stories. And you can tell if you've been looking at them for a while, you can tell which stories are hers because they're so well told. Yeah. She was a very practiced organizer of a story. She did it almost, faultlessly. And her tone of voice is a little more sophisticated, a little more craftsmanlike than some of the other tellers. So it was fascinating to read the stories from that point of view, and it was a great privilege to be able to retell some of them. So I enjoyed those things very much. But all the time, the Book of Dust must have been forming in my head, I suppose.
But so Book of Dust, so that subconscious again, working away, thinking through Book of Dust. Tim asked, you've been described as a religious atheist. Is that still true? And another question here saying, were you put under pressure from the religious lobby to backtrack on any of your views?
Well, the answer to the second question is no, I wasn't, because we're fortunate enough to live in a country and at a time when they do not burn you at the stake for holding views that don't correspond with the official ones. In some parts of the world now, that isn't true, and certainly in this country in the past it wasn't true. But we're living in a little bubble of time, I suppose, which is still warmed by the background radiation from the Enlightenment, you could say, where we are more or less free to express whatever views we want. So that part of that question is easy to answer. The religious atheist one, I think yes, probably. I take religion to be a system for asking questions about and sometimes finding answers to the fundamental questions of our lives. Why are we here? Why are we alive and conscious? What does it mean when what will happen when we die? Is there a reason for all this? Are we just creatures of chance happening in an empty, purposeless universe? all that thing. They're all big important questions, and they're the questions that have been the province of religion. I'm still puzzling about them, as I did 60 years ago when I started thinking about these things. So yes, I'm a religious person, but I don't subscribe to any particular doctrines. I was baptized and confirmed as a member of the Church of England, so I suppose I still am.
And you had a grandfather, Philip, have I got that wrong, who was a vicar?
Yeah, that's right. He was a clergyman.
A good man, or
I loved him. I loved him dearly. He was an old-fashioned country parson. He was born in 1891, and many of his attitudes were profoundly unchanged, profoundly conservative, with a small c, and of his time. I don't think he literally believed every word of the Bible. He wasn't a stupid man. So I remember asking my grandmother about this once, and why did the Bible say God created the world in 6 days, when we know some things, that fossils and so on, have been on the earth for millions of years? And she gave me a very good answer. She said, which I quoted in La Belle Sauvage. She said, well, days were much longer then, dear. So I think that would sum up my grandfather's point of view. Yes, he accepted the truths of evolution and so on, but God set it all going.
Thank you. And Elora says, or Elora maybe, is asking, different subject now, how would you advise a young person to start creative writing? And Dylan from Borton Meadow Academy Primary School says, how do you finish your stories? I always struggle to finish my own stories.
Well, that's a nice question. The beginning of the story is easy because it's exciting and it's new and you want to know what happens and you're getting to know the characters. The end of a story for me, by the time I get within 3 or 4 pages of the end, is okay as well, because I know how it's going to end and what's going to happen. I might even have the final sentence already in my head. It's the bit in the middle that's difficult. And as for the best way of going about it, I'd say, what is it that you want to write? Do you want to write poems, or do you want to write long things like novels? Poems you can do quite quickly. This is why I suppose we have First World War poetry. You could dash off a sonnet in the intervals between bombardments in a trench, but there aren't so many First World War novels because you didn't have time to write a novel. If you are intent, whatever age you are, if you want to write a novel, remember that it's a long process, and there will come times when you don't want to do it. You can't think of what to write next. It's got boring. You're fed up with it. Well, you just have to work through those. You have to carry on. Habit. If you form the habit of going to your desk or sitting on your bed or whatever it is at the same time every day and writing something, just form that habit. You'll find it, eventually you'll find it harder not to do it than it is to do it. And habit is your best friend. Habit has written far more books than inspiration has. So get into the habit of writing every day. That's the only way to get a novel done. And eventually, now I don't know who said this, I came across it quite recently, it made a big impression on me. Eventually you'll be inspired. Inspiration is not a necessary starting point without which you can't even begin. Inspiration is a reward for working well at something. So eventually you'll be inspired.
I love that inversion. Indy says, thank you very much. Diolch in 4. I mispronounced that, but that is thank you very much in Welsh. And
oh yes.
Very grateful to you for speaking in Welsh and for speaking to our university virtually. And then we have a comment from another, this time from a school student, saying, my teacher says that I cannot refer to an author with their first name only. Would you mind if I referred to you as Philip in my school essay?
I think it's a matter of Well, now, if this is a school essay and it's going to be marked, you do what the teacher wants because he or she will mark it accordingly. And if you want a good mark, do what they tell you to do.
Subversive.
That's right. If we met face to face, of course you could call me Philip, and I'd call you. What was the name again? By your first name.
I've lost it.
No, anyway. Yes, of course you call me by my first name. But of course, there are ways of doing these things in critical. Well, if you're writing about an author, the usual thing is to call them by their surname. You know, we talk about Eliot, not Tom. We talk about Shakespeare, not Will. There was a time, about 100 years ago or so, when people felt they had to refer to Jane Austen as Miss Austen. We don't do that anymore. She's Austen. And if you met her, you'd probably have to call her Miss Austen. I don't think she'd take very well to being called Jane. But you can call me Philip by all means.
And Leo, Francisco, Tobias and Angharad have a joint question, which is, which book did you most enjoy writing? And I'm going to put a caveat on that. I'm not going to let you say your last book.
I enjoyed lots of them for different reasons. I enjoyed the Grimm book, which I spoke about just now, because it gave me the chance. Well, it was like being handed the keys to a Rolls Royce, because these stories were already there and I didn't have to make them up. I could just get in and drive them as best I could, as well as I could. I also enjoyed very much a book called Clockwork. This is quite a little book. It's a fairy tale. I've written 4 books I call fairy tales. They're longer than short stories, but they're not quite as long as novels. And I enjoyed Clockwork because it begins and ends with a pun. The full title is Clockwork, or All Wound Up. And it's a complicated story, but the bits of it fit together. I hope I tried to make it like the cogs of a wheel, and this wheel turns that wheel, which goes on to turn another wheel, and so on. And I know that children enjoy doing it with their teachers because they write and tell me so. I think that's probably, it might even be my best book, I don't know, but I certainly enjoyed writing Clockwork.
That's interesting. Bill is asking whether your delight in cabinet making relates in any way to your sense of constructing a plot.
Yes, that's a good question. I think it probably does. But the time to construct the plot is after you've finished the book. That's my experience anyway. Write the thing first, and then you'll see where all the flaws are. Then you'll see where this chapter's too long and needs to be cut in half. And you'll see that you don't need both of these characters because he's doing here exactly what another character was doing there, and you could have one character doing both. And if you've got a surprise happening in the last chapter, work it up, say earlier on, plant a few little seeds earlier on so that they can burst suddenly into bloom in the last chapter, and people will say, oh, isn't that clever? Think of planning all that so early on. It's marvelous. Well, you can do all that sort of stuff after you've finished the first draft of the story. So constructing a plot isn't quite the same as planning a chest of drawers, for example. If you're going to make a chest of drawers, you do need a plan, because you need to know how much wood to buy and what size you have to cut it to and all those things. And you can't make that up or do it. You can't make the thing and then make it better. You can't edit it after you've finished. You've got to plan it first. But I don't do that with a story. Some writers do, but I don't do that.
And 2 very quick, very precise questions here. Eleanor says, what about the Sally Lockhart stories? Who's your favourite character there? And in your opinion, is Mrs. Coulter's main motive always power?
Mrs. Coulter, well, Mrs. Coulter was an interesting character to write about, because at first her motive is power, but then little by little there creeps up on her this extraordinary thing, this extraordinary feeling she's never felt before and never suspected, which is her growing love for her daughter Lyra. That's what makes her interesting to me, and that's what I was looking forward to seeing with Nicole Kidman in the film, and which I'm sure we will see, beautifully acted by Ruth Wilson. So that's the Mrs. Coulter question. As for Sally Lockhart, I very much like the character of Jim and Adelaide. In the we mentioned Adelaide earlier. In the fourth of those books, The Tin Princess, we see that it's a few years later. We can see that Adelaide's grown up, and it's set against the turbulent background of European politics in the 1880s. Bismarck is on the rise. The states of what will later be Germany are coming together in a way, and the Empire of Austria-Hungary is also, there in the background. There's all that going on, and Adelaide, the little servant, the little illiterate servant girl, we saw being in great danger and then being rescued and then running away at the end of the Ruby and the Smoke, turns up in a most unlikely way to find herself married to the prince of this little Central European nation that's caught in the middle of the big turmoil. I was very fond of that book, actually, and I still am, and I'd like to write more about Jim and Adelaide, and of course Sally. So if I'm spared, I will.
And getting towards the end here, the last 2 or 3 minutes, a quick comment, a question here about your view on the pulling down of roads in Oxford following Bristol and London slave yesterday.
Yes, well, it's a fascinating thing. And as David Olusoga, the historian, pointed out, the taking down of the statue in Bristol wasn't a desecration of history, it was history. History was happening there as we saw it. And I don't think they could better the drama of that moment. And it was very well filmed and planned. Pulling the statue down, rolling it down the street, tipping it into the harbour was a brilliant piece of theatre. Now, that can't happen with the Rhodes statue in Oxford. In the first place, it's too high up and you couldn't get up to it. The second place, it's on a main road, it's on the high street. And if you pulled it down, you'd have to clear the place and people would be hit by falling rock and all that sort of stuff. So the whole thing is different. What I would do with the Rhodes statue is this. I commission a statue of King Lobengula, the king of the Ndebele people, who was swindled out of his land by Rhodes. And I'd have the statue of King Lobengula put up across the road from Rhodes. And every year, on a day to be decided, I have the entire law faculty of Oxford University marching or processing to the statue of Rhodes and reading out a charge, an arraignment, a list of all his crimes. Having done that, they go across the road to King Lobengula, put some flowers there, perhaps sing Nkosi Sikelele Africa, and then go off and have lunch. That's what I do. But even before that, with Rhodes, I take down the netting and let the pigeons in to make their own comment on the matter.
Perfect. Adam says, are you paraphrasing more against religion or organized religion? And I'm going to partner that with a question about the use of undue influence in the Brexit campaign. Any views on that?
Well, it's organized religion that's the problem. As soon as religion gets its hands on political power, whether it's in a whole country, a whole nation, or in the confines of one family, but power, you know what I mean, the power to hurt people, the power to command people, then it goes wrong very, very badly, because anybody who justifies what they do by saying, God told me to do this, I'm carrying out the will of God, can get away with anything. You can't argue with that. As far as Brexit and the Russian influence goes, we have yet to hear that story. I wish somebody who has access to it would leak that report into the influence of Russia and indeed other foreign agents on the Brexit campaign, because I'm certain there was some dirty work going on there, and I'd love to see it exposed. But we won't know that until Boris Johnson decides to allow the report to be released, which he probably won't.
Are you optimistic about Brexit?
No, I dread it. I think it was the worst mistake we've ever made. The worst mistake any country's ever made, to separate itself from its closest neighbours, its closest allies, because the United States hasn't been our closest ally for, well, since George Bush came to the White House. And in this willful way, in this utterly stupid, disastrous way, it's an absolute tragedy. Part of the tragedy is the leadership of the Labour Party at the time, but a tragedy is a long story.
Reva says, do you plan novels before you start writing? And the final two questions: is Donald Trump going to appear in volume 3 that you're 50 pages into? And is your best work, Philip, ahead of you?
Oh, I'd like to think my best work is ahead of me. Yes, I'd like to think that. No, Donald Trump won't appear. He's not an interesting character. He's not deep enough. He's not complicated enough. He's a great slab of selfishness. That's all he is. He's a very thin character. He's more like a mask than a person. There are no depths to him at all. What was the first part of the question?
The first part was what are you going to be writing? Have you planned volume 3?
Oh, yes.
Here in your head of Book of Dust.
I don't know what the next sentence is going to be. Never mind where the story is going to be. I discover that as I go along.
I think that's a wonderful. That is 7 o'clock, and that is the end. We apologies to there were 100 or so questions. Apologies for those I didn't have time to answer. We were talking earlier about how differently rewarding this kind of forum can be compared to being at a book festival. Philip, you have been absolutely illuminating and astonishing, and thank you so very much indeed from us all, and we're deeply grateful. Thank you, and wish you all the very best of fortune with volume 3 and beyond.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Anthony, and thank you to all the people who didn't manage to get their questions asked, as well as the ones who did.
Apologies. Thank you very much, all of you. And
thank you, and goodbye.